Hi, welcome back to Let's Talk About Race, a podcast where we discuss the nuanced issues around race in America and attempt to dial down the yelling in order to have real discussion. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by a very special guest, the author of the book A History of White People and an Edwards Professor of American History, Emerita at Princeton University, Professor Nell Painter. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
So I was very interested in your book. I guess we'll kind of dive right into it. There's a lot to cover, but let's start with the very beginning. What is the first time that we actually see the term white being used as a descriptor as it relates to race?
Okay. So, first of all, my book is called The History of White People. That came to my mind because the French edition is being published early next year. And the question of translation came up between l'histoire, the history, or histoire, history. And of course, it's l'histoire, the history. Now, I start with the ancient Greeks because so many Americans believe that we can read our understandings of race backwards 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. And that is not the case. So I had to sort that out first because the idea of races of people, this is taxonomy, starts in the Enlightenment of the 18th century, not before the birth of Christ. So the 18th century, and particularly the 19th century, when so many intellectuals in Europe and the United States became obsessed with classification and with ranking groups of people according to what they called race. It was so tempting to read the 18th and 19th century understandings, the 20th century understandings, even now the 21st century understandings backwards. But that is not scientific.
And is that just because we're kind of working with our, current understanding of it and
Yes.
trying to apply that? Okay.
Yes. But we have to understand that even though the mythology around race, the contents of the ideology says this is something scientific and biological and unchanging. That's the content of the ideology of race. But the ideology of race is an ideology. It's not a biology. And so what people mean by race, what people mean by white race, or what people mean by how many white races there are, that changes over time.
That was one of the things that I found really interesting about reading your book is I think a lot of times we have a modern understanding of whiteness, which, I think we think of as somewhat more definitive than it is and a little more static than it is because we don't have as much context on how much it's changed, how many subdivisions there have been. And I think, in reading your book, one of the things I found really interesting is actually I'd never actually known the origin of the term Caucasian, and the fact that it was actually used in reference to those that were best fit for slavery. Yeah. Do you mind kind of elaborating on that a little bit?
Yeah. So often, I started writing this book. I started thinking about this book because I was perplexed about why white Americans white Americans, that is in the Western Hemisphere, are called Caucasians. In fact, I was just talking to an editor of my French version, and he said that he was totally flummoxed when he came to the United States. And people talked about him as Caucasian. He said, he's French. He said, I'm not from the Caucasus. What is this? And also, the Caucasus is a place between Europe and Asia, and there've been fightings over it forever. But also, it's a place that has been subject to the slave trade. The Black Sea slave trade. And so the people, like the people in Ukraine or in parts of Russia, should I say nourished or supplied the Black Sea slave trade, came from parts of Eurasia, which they called Georgia or the Caucasus.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, would a literal Caucasian person not consider themselves white?
I don't know, but probably not if they were in the Caucasus or in Russia. In Russia, the people of the Caucasus are considered black. And it's right, Cherny. And
yeah.
it has more to do with there being sort of rough people and the Cossacks, and it's another story that doesn't fit well in American history. But the people of the Caucasus who come to the United States quickly learn that they are considered white.
Okay. Yeah, it's always very interesting to me how American-centric my idea of race is. I really didn't understand it, even up until kind of like our initial conversation. I had assumed that the idea of whiteness was a lot more universal than it is. I have a very, when did we first see, is there a particular region or, I know you mentioned the Enlightenment period where people, first do self-identify as white?
Well, we talk about the second half of the 18th century, but you're asking where people self-identify as white. And there, I'm not so sure. I think I would say in the southern United States, where the black-white dichotomy is of crucial importance. And I think there you would have people claiming their whiteness. But in Emerson's Massachusetts, for instance, there the distinctions would be between Celts and Saxons. These are different, at that time, races of white people.
Right. And is that fair to equate to kind of modern, like English, Irish, is kind of my understanding of those two groups?
Well, kind of. Irish people were considered part of the Celtic race, which is a white race.
Right.
It's not a question of their becoming white. They were white. Adult men could vote, even if they were very poor, they could vote. So they were considered white. But in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, educated Americans thought that there was more than one white race. This is really hard for Americans now to understand. That part of the changing definitions included the numbers of white races.
Wow.
So in Emerson's time, he thought of a number of white races, and the best one was his, which was Teutonic or Saxon. Some people said Anglo-Saxon, which was sort of English. And the Saxon part was a kind of a part of Germany, and they were very vague about that. So it worked more as Americans of English descent, and they were considered better than Celts, who were Irish people or Welsh people or Scottish people.
In your book, you talk about the four enlargements of American whiteness. And
yes.
So we started with the Saxon, Celt kind of initial. Do you mind walking through kind of how whiteness expanded from there?
In the early 19th century, the states changed their voting requirements. So who can vote goes state by state. And by and large, states let anybody who had property vote before the Jacksonian era in the early 19th century. And so in places like Rhode Island or Pennsylvania, property black men could vote. The changing in the Jacksonian era, the era of the common man, so to speak, added color. And so black men were, for all intents and purposes, disfranchised, and poor white men were enfranchised because women were not enfranchised. And then in the Civil War, large numbers of immigrants, notably Irish immigrants, served in the Union, And by that service, were able to use the Homestead Act, for instance, and move to the West, but also in places like California to drive out the Chinese immigrants who had done a lot of the work in building the railroads. And they specifically phrased their driving out of Chinese workers as white men, not as Irish. Then there's a big wave from the late 19th, but especially the early 20th century, of working people, poor people from Eastern and Southern Europe. And they get classified as inferior white races. Eastern European Hebrews, that's one race. Northern Italians, that's another race. Southern Italians, that's another race. Slavs, that's another race. Greeks, that's another race. With the New Deal of the 30s, and then the national mobilization in the Second World War, the 40s, there we have the anthropologists, interestingly enough, who become the experts, who explain that no, there are not many white races. There's only one white race. So there's one white race among the three races. So there's three races. There's the Caucasians, who's the white race, and then there's the Mongoloids, who are the Asians, and then there the Negroids, and they are people of Africa and African descent.
What actually prompted those classifications to first happen?
Well, classification is part of the Enlightenment. It's part of understanding the world around us. So that started, you might say kind of innocently, as a way to understand the world. So there were lots of ways to do that, and you mentioned some of them, which were measuring skulls. That was a very popular way because skulls seem to be more permanent than trying to figure out what somebody's skin color was or eye color could be, because people could disagree on what do you call it? But skulls, if you were dead and the skin was off and the hair was off, you could measure kind of pretty well according to what they considered the scientific method. So I didn't use crackpots.
Okay.
I didn't use wild-eyed racists. I didn't use Klansmen. I used people who were respected in their time as scientists. That was science.
The original reason why I kind of had this conversation was I'd had kind of the discussion about, is race a social construct or a scientific construct? I had this conversation with my dad, and it's not that there isn't, a 23andMe test can show some genetic variation, but it's
yes.
where those boundaries are created, and the fact that, right now we have a blanket white, that covers all the different kinds of, different whites.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And to me, it's like, okay, if the boundaries are socially construed, then it doesn't matter what science existed, because that's not what's creating, our definitions.
I understand the yearning for certainty, the yearning for who am I, where do I come from? But even if you discover that 23% of your DNA matches that of people from, say, the Caucasus or what is now Nigeria, does that make you them? One of the things I learned in the 1960s when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, I graduated in anthropology, and Franz Boas was the reigning expert. And one of his great contributions was decoupling biology from culture, so that biology is one thing and culture is another. And culture has to do with how people live.
And so do you think that we absorbed some cultural factors into our definitions of race?
Absolutely.
what's interesting is white, and I think you mentioned this in a lot of the modern definition of whiteness, is that in some ways it almost kind of goes beyond, it's gone beyond a skin tone, because you can find many light-skinned people from, Syria or from, different parts of the world that might not be considered white. And so there does seem to be this very cultural importance to who is classified as white.
I would say not only cultural, but also political. You mentioned Syrians. How do people get classified, say, in the census or in the law? And the law is the law of naturalization that I'm thinking of. How do people get allowed to naturalize as white? So before 1965, you had to either naturalize as white or black. And that was before the dismantling of Jim Crow. So it was not advantageous for people coming to the United States to naturalize as black, because it carried a lot of handicaps. But how do you naturalize as white? So This actually went to the Supreme Court a couple of times, and I won't take you through that because it's very interesting. But a group of Syrians had to sue to be able to naturalize as white. So it's not just science, it's also law.
That's very interesting. So it's actually the arbiters of race is our census, is that correct?
The census is a policy document, and so it changes every 10 years according to how policy needs change. So people think of the census as scientific, but the census is policy. And one group, for instance, Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, again went to Congress to be considered a race. How scientific is that? That is political. Right. So a lot of our thinking about what is race is political.
One thing I actually wanted to talk to you about, so a little bit of context here. So for my mix, my mom is Persian and my dad is half Korean and half Latvian Jew, which again...
Oh, wow. What an American you are.
Well, that's great. I think so as well. But it's interesting because it's one of the main reasons why it's always, the classification of race has always been interesting to me, is because when I have to fill out the surveys, I never knew how to fill it out. It's like, am I Asian? Sure, yes. Korean, Iran's in Asia. Yeah. Am I Middle Eastern? Sure, yes. Am I white? Kind of. Like other, like it's really, I'll fill out any of the three. So, to me, it's interesting because I actually learned about halfway, I think I was like 16 or something, that Persians consider themselves Aryan. I never thought of themselves as being white, but they actually, a lot of Persians consider themselves white. They can, they say we're Aryan people, and there's actually, it's interesting because we get lumped in by a lot of Americans with other Middle Easterns, but a lot of Persians are kind of a little bit anti-Arab, to be honest. So it's again, I've seen a lot of those, like, I don't want to say hypocrisy because that's, so negative, but it's just interesting seeing how a lot of people assume certain things as taken, as a given. And so myself, my mom's actually the lightest member of our family, and she's, considered maybe the most brown if you're defining kind of the others, as you say,
a person of color.
Exactly. And so it's always felt very arbitrary to me. The thing I want to touch upon is that classification, particularly in, let's say, the SAT, in college applications, government censuses, whoever are people who are forcing you to fill out those boxes. Mm-hmm. I guess, do you think that is an outdated system? Do you think it serves a function, or do you think that it reinforces kind of, arbitrary racial distinction?
All of the above. All of the above. Because that classification system outside of the census, where it really makes a difference, like where money goes, where federal money goes, I think is rooted in our history of our racist history, our white supremacist history, our Jim Crow history, our history of killing black people and separate but not equal, all of that. So, and it gets with people like you, and you're not the first person I've heard of who has such a complicated
of course.
backstory. You know, this is what we are now. And so the system of classification is breaking down. It's just too complicated. But the people who push to get rid of it are reactionaries who want to undo affirmative action. And affirmative action as one of the weakest reads, but the only one we have practically, of redressing historical injuries of class based on black-white race. You know, there has been some concern that there won't be enough white people after 2040, but there will be. There'll always be in our racist society enough white people, because the meaning of whiteness is more than just skin color. You say that you're Asian, you're a person of color, mother is the whitest person. So obviously there's more going on there than color.
Yes.
So, you know, where you go to college, how much money you have, where you live, what gym you go to, what you eat, you know, all of that makes whiteness. And I think that whiteness has already lost a lot of its importance. And I think with Asian Americans, I'm talking to you from New Jersey, where we have a significant proportion of South Asians who can be very brown, but who also can be very well educated and wealthy. And so those are the markers of whiteness, at least in the past. So brownness and the markers of whiteness can go together in New Jersey. And so it may turn out that Asian Americans are the new white people. I don't know.
You know, correct me if I'm wrong, because you have the experience, but one of the things that Americans seem to comment on when they travel is that we seem to have a really strong emphasis on race, particularly kind of the binary white-black that isn't as present in a lot of places. So do you think that our definition of whiteness is almost a reaction from the need to define blackness for slavery and later segregation?
Yes. When I published the history of white people in 2010, I knew that it was not going to translate into Europe, where religious differences have been so much more salient. Anti-Semitism being the great outlier, but now also anti-Muslim. So the way Europeans tend to chop themselves up has not been the way Americans have chopped themselves up, largely because of our history of the Atlantic slave trade. So, but recently, since 2010, a couple of things have happened to make my book, The History of White People, interesting to Europeans, because the whole crush of immigrants has changed the way Europeans think about nation and about difference. And so they're moving toward understanding the American system of white-black. American history is just drenched with blood, and the history of race in America is frightful. It's awful. However, since the 1960s, 70s, 80s, since the changes of the late 20th century, which we have fought over, we have fought each other about this, but we have gone through some of those steps that Europeans are just starting to look at. So Americans, with all our bloody history, have some lessons. You know, a lot of them are lessons, don't do that. Have lessons to teach other people in the world about dealing with others with a big O, capital O, others, and embracing multiculturalism, embracing multiracialism. So many societies in the world, whether they announce it or not, kind of base their idea of who they are in a kind of blood and soil, not birthright citizenship, but ethnic citizenship, racial citizenship, biological citizenship. And what Americans are moving toward, and maybe Canadians have done it better, is understanding ourselves as multi-ethnic and multiracial. I mean, this is a country built on immigration and also genocide, unfortunately, and some of that immigration is not immigration that people wanted, but e pluribus unum means out of many, one. And this is very different from many other nations in the world.
The last thing I want to ask you, this podcast being called Let's Talk About Race, my intention is to try and have people see their similarities more than their differences and reduce some of the animosity that happens when we become kind of isolated and a little bit echo chambered. You're the first person I've talked to from a very academic standpoint, and it's very fascinating to hear your perspective. If I could ask you how you might encourage others to go about either something they should do or something they should educate themselves on to, hopefully encourage us seeing each other as one. Do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah. Not to talk about race.
Interesting. Okay. And
to talk about race, unless people have educated themselves, seems to just bring out the worst in people. Talking in generalities, getting up on high horses, talking about things going off half-cocked.
Because you'd prefer to not have, half-truths and generalities used.
Yeah. If you want to talk about race, talk about particular instances and talk from knowing something about what you're talking about.
Well, I think on that note, I would encourage everyone to read The History of White People, not A History of White People. From every review I've read, it's considered one of the most exhaustive recounts of all the instances of whiteness as it appears to our history. So again, thank you so much for your time, Professor Painter. I really appreciated, learning from you and all that you've done. And thanks so much for being on the show.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed talking to you.